Fuck the authority, Channel 5 News.
Channel 55. We don't fuck with custers. And 5 is the best number.
In 2003, a fossil was discovered in an ancient lakebed in what's now China. It was almost a complete skeleton about the size of a platypus with teeth that resembled a seal's. And in the rock surrounding it, there was a shadow. That shadow was the preserved impression of skin and other soft tissue, including a furry pelt, webbed feet, and a paddle-shaped tail. It looked like a typical aquatic mammal, the kind you might see near a river or lake today. But this creature lived in the Jurassic period, 164 million years ago, and it wasn't technically a mammal. It was a mammaliaform, part of the group that includes mammals and our ancient relatives. And for a long time, scientists had thought of the mammaliaforms that lived during the Mesozoic era as small shrew-like insectivore generalists scurrying in the shadows of the dinosaurs. But this discovery complicated the history of mammaliaforms. It painted a picture of their explosive diversification, their mysterious disappearance, and how our own ancestors might have survived thanks to a leg up from some leafy allies. Now, we know that placental mammals like us humans belong to a group called Eutheria, while marsupials like kangaroos and koalas belong to a group called Metatheria. Eutherians and Metatherians share a more recent common ancestor than other mammal groups, so together we're referred to as therians. And monotremes, like the platypus and echidna, are our next closest living relatives. Together, therians, monotremes, and all the animals back to our most recent common ancestor form what's called the crown mammal group. The mammaliaforms are basically one more step removed from there. It's the group that includes crown mammals and their most recent common ancestor, plus all the mammal-like animals that are more closely related to mammals than they are to anything else. The common ancestor of the mammaliaforms would have looked something like Morganucodon, a small insect-eating mammal that scurried through the undergrowth of the late Triassic around 200 million years ago. And the descendants of mammaliaforms like Morganucodon would eventually give rise to our mammal ancestors, which were also small insectivores. For a long time, it was thought that all Mesozoic mammaliaforms were built like this because of the imposing ecological presence of the dinosaurs. Many thought it wasn't until the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction that space was freed up for the mammals to adapt to new niches. But mammaliaforms were rare in the fossil record, and paleontologists were lucky to find more than a few teeth or parts of a jaw. So this hypothesis wasn't exactly based on a ton of material. Occasionally, more substantial fossils were uncovered, but even they were mostly tiny, like the genus from China known as Zhanghatherium. And while it's true that most mammaliaforms did fit this description, a site in northern China has recently flipped the script. There, layers of Jurassic lake sediment and volcanic ash deposits have preserved the fossils of a huge variety of organisms. And that's where a mysterious paddle-tailed mammaliaform was discovered. It belonged to an ancient group called the Docodonts, and was named Castorocata, from castor meaning beaver, and cata meaning tail, after its, well, beaver-shaped tail. Measuring at least 42.5 centimeters long and weighing up to 800 grams, it may not have been huge by our standards, but it's the biggest Jurassic mammaliaform ever found. Castorocata also sported the oldest evidence of a furry pelt, which indicates it was warm-blooded. This suggests that some of the characteristics we associate with crowned mammals are actually ancestral traits that existed long before we emerged. But its size and its fur are only part of what made this fossil so special. Castorocata was a far cry from a tiny scurrying generalist. With its webbed feet, paddle tail, and teeth adapted for catching fish, the scientists who described it recognized it as a semi-aquatic specialist. And this pushed the emergence of the first aquatic mammaliaforms back by over 100 million years, which meant the mammaliaforms were developing specialized traits much earlier than we thought, despite the supposedly restrictive presence of the dinosaurs. And it soon became clear that Castorocata wasn't the only fuzzy innovator in this fossil deposit. over the next few years, scientists began uncovering more evidence that they'd been kind of wrong about these ancient critters. Mammaliaforms had actually experienced a period of major ecological radiation. And not only that, this radiation revealed fast rates of evolutionary change that peaked in the mid-Jurassic. But why? What caused it? Well, when separate lineages start to radiate at the same time, it suggests that something is going on in the environment that benefits multiple groups. During this time, Pangaea was in the process of breaking up, which transformed ecosystems. And scientists soon realized that this breakup gave Docodonts and other groups the chance to radiate into new niches and develop brand new adaptations. Like the tunneling Docophosaur with its sprawling limbs and paws like moles for shoveling earth. Or the squirrel-like sap-eating Agilodocodon with its curved claws and flexible elbow, wrist, and ankle joints for climbing. Members of another mammaliaform group, Heremydia, were also getting in on the action. The fossilized imprint of skin membranes stretching between their limbs indicates that these animals could glide from tree to tree. In
sugar
addition to the
gliders.
environmental change, this mammaliaform radiation might have also been a result of good timing. Because ever since the Triassic, mammaliaform groups had been gaining adaptations like fur, warm-bloodedness, lactation, and modifications to the jaw and inner ear,
Lactation.
sometimes convergently. Developing this critical mass of advantageous traits could have made it easier for them to explore new environments and adapt to specialized roles. Now, the ancestors of crown mammals were also a part of this mid-Jurassic radiation, but while they saw a major increase in species diversity, they stayed true-like. For example, the late Jurassic Jeremiah, another mammal from that lake bed formation and the earliest known Therian. If Jeremiah wasn't our direct ancestor, it was at least a close relative, and would have looked a lot like our Jurassic ancestors. So if other mammaliaforms weren't nearly as constrained by dinosaurs as we thought, why did our ancestors stay so small? Well, a recent study found that other mammaliaforms actually had a greater role in suppressing the diversification of the Therians than the dinosaurs did, because of their good timing. Those mammaliaforms had shown up on the scene earlier than the crowned mammals and occupied the available specialist niches before Therians had a chance to compete. Now, that doesn't mean that the dinosaurs had no influence. As far as we know, they did prevent ancient mammaliaforms from ever getting bigger than a hefty house cat. But it goes both ways. The
Hefty
presence
house
of
cat.
mammaliaforms in these smaller-bodied roles would have also limited the ability of dinosaurs to exploit those same niches. And our ancestors were perfectly suited to the insectivore niche they occupied, which may have been their saving grace for the changes that were to come. After all, there's a reason that we're here now. So why did our ancestors survive while other mammaliaforms didn't? Trying to figure out how, when, and why most of the others disappeared is challenging. Because we can't identify a line in the fossil record with diverse mammaliaform remains on one side and only Therians and monotremes on the other. Even with all the new discoveries, mammaliaform fossils are still relatively rare, and when they do turn up, it's usually only teeth. But those teeth allow us to identify which group these critters belong to and draw conclusions about their lifestyle, distribution, and diversity at different times. For example, from the mid to late Jurassic, about 175 to 145 million years ago, there are teeth belonging to all kinds of mammaliaforms in the fossil record.
Mammalia.
But around this time, many mammaliaforms were also starting to
Mammalia.
experience a decline. This decline was not marked by a destructive cataclysm, but instead by a gradual two-phase process. A study analyzing mammaliaform fossil distribution throughout the Mesozoic found that they first experienced a restriction in range. And then, during the Cretaceous, around 125 million years ago, the record reveals a decrease in species richness. During this time, in most areas, two types of teeth replaced all the others in the fossil record. The first type were similar
Canine.
molars, belonging to the multituberculates, a rat-like group of crowned mammals whose teeth mark them as plant eaters. The second type were triposphenic molars. These are the kind of molars you have, and they're the kind of molars ancestral placentals and marsupials had. Studies indicate that this kind of tooth has a greater capacity to evolve into varied forms than some of the other tooth types. And in the late Cretaceous, they took on a form that could cut, pierce, and chew exoskeletons. These were the teeth of a small, insectivorous generalist. This change coincided with the Cretaceous terrestrial revolution, a time of ecological upheaval that lasted from 125 to 80 million years ago. It was an event that would alter ecosystems forever: the spread of flowering plants. Flowering plants, or angiosperms, made up less than 5% of terrestrial plant species at the start of the period. But by the end of the Cretaceous, they dominated the land, comprising over 80% of terrestrial plant species. As flowering plants spread, small insect-eating mammals were in the perfect position to take advantage of the insect pollinators that diversified in response to this expanding niche. The ability of angiosperms to outcompete other plants in many regions even helped them make the climate more humid, expanding the world's wet tropical habitats, which began to spread into what's now North America and Eurasia. And mammals' ability to climb trees and travel across uneven terrain likely helped them to navigate the spreading tropical forests. At the same time, the growing abundance of fleshy fruit and seeds provided new nutritional opportunities for the herbivorous multituberculates. And their high energy needs may have driven them to compete more fiercely for resources. Such a dramatic change in the environment would have been a stressor for highly specialized animals that relied on specific resources, leaving many mammaliaforms struggling to adapt. But small generalist therians that were less reliant on stable conditions persisted. In this way, evidence suggests that the spread of angiosperms helped our ancestors succeed by tipping the scales against their ancient mammaliaform relatives. Some recently published fossil finds suggest that during this time, monotremes had radiated into diverse forms in Australia. But therians weren't free to take over quite yet. Other crowned mammal groups were still around and had started to specialize. The most successful of these was the multituberculates, a group that had taken advantage of the new abundance of vegetation brought on by the spread of angiosperms. They and several other mammal groups would go on to survive the KPG mass extinction, diversifying and competing with placentals, marsupials, and monotremes. But now we know that this era of evolutionary rivalry was nothing new for the mammals. Instead, it was the next chapter of a story that had played out over millions of years of mammaliaform history, from the diverse docodonts of the Jurassic to the angiosperms that helped our ancestors get a foot in the evolutionary door. Eventually, competition in a changing climate caused the last of those other mammal groups to disappear, leaving the monotremes and therians to diversify. The diversification resulted in the return of countless forms, from the shovel paws to the gliding membranes and the paddle-tails that our ancient relatives pioneered. And that shift left our own group, the placentals, to become the most successful, diverse mammaliaforms to ever live, so far.
Okay.
Before you go, we wanted to let you know that Complexly is making a 2025 wall calendar, but this year, all of our shows contributed to one calendar. For 2025, the folks behind SciShow, Crash Course, Bizarre Beast, Study Hall, and of course, PBS Eons, for the Eons, we wanted to highlight our favorite incredibly well-preserved each month topic. Find your 2025 Complexly calendar now at complexly.store/calendar.
And we gotta crown this month's Eontologists.
Addie, Annie, and Eric Higgins, Carl Wofel, Jake Hart, John Davison Ing, Juan M., Melanie Lamb Carnevale, Nico Robin, and Raphael Hasse.
By becoming an Eonite at patreon.com/eons, you can get fun perks like access to behind-the-scenes content, including clips from Eon shoots. And as always, thanks for joining me in the Ken Barnes studio. Subscribe at youtube.com/eons for more Cretaceous creatures. Together, therians, monotremes, and all them animals, all them animals. I'm really feeling that Montana spirit, I guess.
On. Pilot off. Flaps 2.
This episode is brought to you by Curiosity Stream.
This is not smoke, and this isn't a smokestack, at least not the kind we normally think of. It serves a totally different purpose at a power plant than smokestacks, whose job is moving combustion products high into the air, allowing them to disperse away from populated spaces. Maybe you already knew that, or at least suspected it. After all, you saw the title of this video. Plus, this kind of tower is commonly associated with nuclear plants that don't combust anything at all to create the heat that drives their generators. But that heat is the key. The largest class of power plants, called thermal power stations, use steam turbines, or turbines depending on how you say it. But once that steam makes it through the turbine, it needs to be condensed back into liquid water. It's kind of frustrating. You spend all those resources heating the water up, and then you spend even more resources to cool it back down. And a power plant isn't much good if all the electricity it generates gets used up just trying to cool that steam back down. So engineers have come up with some pretty creative ways to cool huge amounts of water, like millions of gallons or tens of thousands of cubic meters per hour, and do it relatively efficiently. Not all cooling towers look like this, but there are some really clever reasons for that iconic shape we all recognize, and I'm going to build one in the garage to show you how they work. I'm Grady, and this is Practical Engineering. Power plants could just vent steam into the atmosphere, but generally, they don't do that. For one, it wouldn't be good for the environment. The heat, moisture, and noise would affect wildlife and weather. For two, it would waste a lot of water. The feed water for a boiler is often carefully treated to avoid corrosion and mineral buildup in the machinery. It's expensive water, so it doesn't make sense to set it free. And for three, it would waste a lot of energy. It's generally less expensive to cool the steam down just enough to condense it back into liquid water so it can be reused as feed water. But even that is an enormous challenge. I talked a little bit about how power plants actually consume a lot of energy in a previous video. It's a net positive, of course, but any energy you spend on all the industrial processes requiring
Landed a little heavy.
electricity at scale is energy not being sent out to the grid, and that includes cooling. So engineers want to do it efficiently. One simple option is to use a cooler stream of water that already exists, like a river, lake, or sea. And in fact, there are a lot of power plants near me that do exactly that. This plant draws water from the lake on the south side, sends it through condensers, and then releases it into a channel where it flows to the north side of the lake. The slow circulation gives that water time to cool down before it reaches the plant again. But it's not feasible to have a lake or river for cooling water at every thermal power plant, and there are a lot of environmental impacts with the heat and intakes that require careful consideration. So instead, lots of power plants use cooling towers. You might be familiar with the various machines humans have devised for cooling stuff down. You might even be enjoying the comfort of such a device right this very minute. But like I mentioned, the simplest way to cool something is to simply let natural physical processes do the work. Just wait for entropy to do its thing. After all, the temperature is usually less than boiling outside, so the heat from steam will naturally transfer to the ambient air if you let it.
Damn, it's super
So that's
windy.
what many cooling towers do. Kind of. I designed a cooling tower in my garage so I can show you exactly how this works. This is made from laser-cut strips of acrylic with a carefully selected shape. And when I carefully tape these carefully sized strips together, I get a nice, somewhat transparent cooling tower. This is a model of a natural draft tower. It's not the most common type out there, but it is one of the simplest and also the most iconic and recognizable, so it's perfect for this demonstration. You may have noticed the holes I drilled in the bottom of each acrylic strip. This tower needs a way for air to get inside at the bottom. If you look closely at the real thing, you'll see something similar. They aren't continuous all the way down, but actually open around the bottom. Steam from turbines doesn't go to the cooling tower directly. Instead, there's a separate stream of water, aptly called the cooling water. The steam is condensed into liquid water in the condenser that's cooled by the cooling water, which then flows between the condenser and the tower. I'm simulating that here with a bucket of hot water and a beer brewing pump. That hot water gets pumped to
I don't
sprayers
get it.
inside the tower. If you know a little bit about thermodynamics, you know that we can only get this water as cool as the ambient air temperature. Heat naturally flows from hot to cold, so you can't get any more heat transfer once the water reaches the outside temperature. But if you know a little bit more about thermodynamics, you know there's a trick that can improve the performance of a system like this. And this layer of material below the sprayers is the key. This is called fill. I'm just using a dehumidifier pad, but in an actual cooling tower,
What the
fill
fuck?
is usually a layer of plastic, carefully designed to maximize the surface area of the water in the system. It does this by forcing the water to either splash into tiny drops or form thin sheets as it falls downward. The goal is to expose as much surface area of the hot water as possible to the air flowing through the tower. Water drips down, air flows up. The pros call this counterflow, and it's the trick to the whole process. Actually, you can use crossflow as well, but let's jump over that rabbit hole for now. You might think the outside air has just one temperature, but to cooling professionals, it has two. One we call the dry bulb temperature is what you normally encounter. That's what shows up in the weather report. It's what's on the thermometer. But air also has a wet bulb temperature. If you soak the end of a thermometer and pass it through the air, that water will evaporate. The drier the air, the more easily water evaporates. This is why it feels so much hotter when it's also humid outside. It takes energy, called latent heat, to convert water from a liquid to a gas, and that energy is absorbed from the liquid water, cooling it down. So as long as the ambient air isn't already saturated, 100% relative humidity, you can actually cool water below the dry bulb temperature using evaporation. And the lower the humidity of the air, the more evaporation can take place, so the bigger the difference in wet and dry bulb temperatures. This isn't anything revolutionary. Nature figured out evaporative cooling millions of years ago. It's why we sweat when it's hot. But using it at this scale is really impressive. And it's not the only innovation in a natural draft cooling tower. For that, I need to show you a cool graph. This is a psychrometric chart. It looks pretty intimidating. You could spend an entire college course learning about this stuff, and there are probably a few HVAC professionals groaning at the screen right now. But I just want to use it to explain a few important things about the physical and thermal properties of air. First, as the temperature of air goes up, its capacity to hold water goes up too. Kind of like hot tea can dissolve more sugar than cold tea, hot air can hold more water than cold air. Next, as air temperature goes up, its density goes down. Confusingly, the psychrometric chart actually shows specific volume, which is the inverse of air density. So as you move up in temperature,
I'm sure that's interesting.
And what he would do differently if he was given another chance, and now he will seemingly get that chance.
Good point, Cypher.
We're going to have the largest deportation in the history of our country.
Ugh.
Well, if this is it, old boy, I hope you don't mind if I go out speaking to kings.
By all means, Captain.
So, Inglourious Bastards is packed with legendary scenes you've probably seen analyzed more than once.
Yes.
But if there's one that blows my mind every time I watch it, it's this one. Especially because of how it pulls us into characters we're only just meeting around the 50-minute mark of the film. So today, I want to dive into what makes this scene so brilliant.
And what would that be?
To put it simply, the whole
Sure.
point of this scene is how a mission that should be a simple, straightforward move, just gathering the team, turns into a complete disaster, but to understand why it's so good, let me give you some context. The scene takes up most of the 4th chapter, titled Operation Kino, which has 5 parts. It starts with the introduction of
Lieutenant Archie Hickox, reporting south.
a former film critic assigned to meet up with the bastards and Bridget before heading to a premiere organized by the Third Reich.
In Nadine, there's a tavern called La Louisiane. There you'll rendezvous with our double agent. She'll take you from there. She's the one who's going to get you into the premiere.
Thing is, as you probably remember, all the top German officials will be there.
We have all our rotten eggs in one basket.
So the point is...
The objective of Operation Kino?
Well, you know...
Blow up the basket.
And at this point, I can't help but notice how those red curtains really connect with the final chapter's cinema scene. Maybe it's because this is where we, as viewers, find out about the plan.
Are you familiar with German cinema under the Third Reich?
But the truth is, the whole chapter plays with the idea of meta-cinema, with Tarantino's war heroes as an actress and the only soldier capable of this mission.
Goebbels considers the films he's making to be the beginning of a new era in German cinema.
A film geek, almost as if part of a fantasy, who also happens to love whiskey. Which is why his second line after saying his name hints at the element that will decide his fate.
Drink. If you offered me a scotch and plain water, I could drink a scotch and plain water.
Because in a film packed with tense, table-centered scenes, the characters' props tell us a lot about them. When Landa orders milk instead of wine, it's like he's toying with his victims.
Probieren Sie den Champagner, Mademoiselle. Der ist wirklich ganz gut.
Later, years on, when Shoshana meets Frederick, the first thing they serve is champagne. It's a way of showing through action that she's welcome at the table. But when Landa later sits with her, he orders...
Et pour la demoiselle, un verre de lait.
And it takes us right back to the first scene. Shoshana is no longer a guest. Now she's under interrogation.
All I have to do is pick up this phone right here, inform the cinema, and your plan's kaput.
The opposite happens when Landa negotiates with Aldo about ending the war, this time with the phone at the center of the frame, representing Landa's power to either end the Allies' plan or strike a deal with the higher-ups.
You end the war.
At first, all the power is with him, and everything significant is in his shot. But as he begins to negotiate, he treats Aldo and Smithson as equals by sharing drinks.
So, gentlemen, let's discuss the prospect of ending the war tonight.
And the item distribution on the table starts to shift.
Get me someone on the other end of that radio with the power of the pen to authorize my... let's call it the terms of my conditional surrender.
When the balance of power tips toward Aldo, the phone finally appears in his frame. You just need to watch how the scene unfolds to see the gradual power shift. And these directional choices also play out in the bar scene, so let's head over there. But before we keep going with the breakdown, I wanted to share with you a bit about the process behind it, because you might be like me. Spending hours online researching, studying, or working on projects with 80 tabs open. Well, something that's really helped me work with less stress and way more productivity has been switching to Opera, a browser packed with simple features. In another is the different OG where you're sitting at a shung will go wrong.
You said it was in a tavern.
It is a tavern.
Yeah, in a basement.
First off, it's in a basement, the worst possible place for a fight. Because even though they say,
you know, we're not looking for trouble right now,
we know things are about to go south. After all, we're watching a Tarantino film, and the second issue was emphasized by this cut.
She wasn't picking a place to fight. She was picking a place isolated, and without Germans.
Ich bin männlich. Ich bin eine literarische Figur.
Originally, the scene runs half a minute longer in the script, but editor Sally Menke decides to cut it here, probably to emphasize the joke.
Männlich. Ich bin eine literarische Figur. Ich bin aus Amerika. Aber darüber lässt sich streiten, ja.
The camera starts on a single German soldier, building suspense because you don't know how many more might be there.
Die Nationalität des Autors hat doch nichts mit der Nationalität der Figur zu tun.
The dialogue here is classic Tarantino, one of those long speeches. But if you read between the lines, it's already hinting at the scene's core themes: identity and nationality.
Hamlet ist kein Brite, er war Däne. Also ja, diese Figur ist auf jeden Fall in Amerika geboren.
As the conversation unfolds, we don't see exactly how many Germans there are, but from Bridget's gaze, we can tell there's more than one, at least 3. This slow reveal has more impact than simply showing all the Germans at once, and then Tarantino does this.
Schnaps, 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 Schnaps. 5 Schnapszelte.
He uses the drink order to reveal that there are 5 soldiers. The genius here is how Tarantino quickly builds a sense of familiarity with the German soldiers in just a few seconds, presenting them as a friendly group you could easily know yourself.
Heißt mein Blutsbruder Old Shatterhand?
He creates this closeness through the lens, making us feel like we're right at the table, and by giving us close-ups of them. He's not just introducing them, he's individualizing these background characters who, in any other movie, would be a homogeneous group. And as I mentioned before, the production design here tells us a bit about the characters. While the German soldiers sip beer from metal mugs like pawns, Bridget, a movie diva, drinks champagne in a delicate glass goblet, a refined drink that evokes status and, being a French beverage, aligns her with the Allied side. Right before the bastards arrive, the bartender briefly crosses the screen with another full glass. A subtle hint that someone else is in the bar, and when you watch it again, you realize that the drink is actually for Major Hellstrom. On the other hand, one thing to watch throughout the scene is how Tarantino uses space. This setting is the opposite of the last one, which was so absurdly big that it made the characters look like dolls in a huge room. And I think the movie does this on purpose to make the contrast hit harder later, when we're in this confined space, where every element makes it feel